The original Xbox was massive, and now it fits in your pocket. Hey everyone, RetroTechDad here, and I am very excited about this one because original Xbox emulation on Android is finally becoming viable. I briefly featured it in my recent Retroid Pocket Nova review, and after seeing what was already possible, I immediately knew a dedicated Xbox showcase had to happen. So today we're diving into original Xbox emulation on Android using HakuX, and more importantly, we're going to see just how much of this incredible library we can already play on something that fits in the palm of your hand. So let's get HakuX set up first, go through the important settings, and then we'll get into the games. For this video, I'm using the 12GB version of the Retroid Pocket Nova, but results should be similar across other Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 handhelds like the entirety of the Odin 2 lineup, the AYN Thor, and the Retroid Pocket 6. So let's head on over to the HakuX GitHub page and grab the latest APK. As always, I'll have everything you need linked in the description. HakuX is a fork of X1box that's specifically optimized for Adreno-based devices, which makes something like the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 inside the Nova a great fit. The version I used for all of my testing is version 0.3.1, so keep that in mind if you're using something newer and your results differ slightly. Tap on the app-release.apk and then wait for it to do its thing, and then tap on open, and you might get a prompt to allow unknown sources. Just go ahead and enable it and then proceed to install. With that done, let's go ahead and open up HakuX for just a moment. On the welcome screen, you can see that we already need some additional files, and I actually have a GitHub page linked that contains all the files needed for this initial setup process for HakuX, including the boot ROM, flash ROM, and then the hard disk image. Under the releases page, download the Xbox emulator file zip to your device, and once it's done downloading, go into the zip file and then extract the contents, which consists of 3 different folders to your device. It doesn't really matter where you extract them to, since we will point the emulator to the correct file. Just double check that the folders were extracted correctly, and then once you've confirmed that, we can head on back over to the emulator to resume the setup process. Okay, first things first, choose your MCPX ROM file by going into the MCPX folder that we just extracted and then select the mcpx.bin file. Once it's been copied, tap on next, and then let's go ahead and select the flash ROM by going into the BIOS folder and selecting the flash.bin file. And again, once it's done copying, tap on next, and finally we can select the hard drive image by going to the HDD folder and choosing the Xbox HDD.qcow2 file. We've got one more step, which is to select the games folder, and I like to keep my games in a folder just named Xbox to keep things simple. HakuX supports both .iso and .xiso formats. The cool thing about HakuX is that it will automatically convert your ISO files to the XISO format, so no worries there. Welcome to the main screen of HakuX, and if all went well, your games library should be displayed here. HakuX will take care of things and actually download fancy cover art for your games to make things look a bit nicer if you prefer when you select the cover grid option. Okay, so let's now dive into the default options and discuss a few things in the settings section by tapping on the wrench icon in the top right corner. We have a few things to look at here, so let's just go in order and start with the HakuX data option. And there's not a whole lot to discuss here. You can change your games directory as needed and any of the system files as well. If you scroll all the way down to the bottom, just be mindful of the clear cache partitions and recreate hard disk options. The clear cache partitions is useful as a troubleshooting method in case you have a game that is registering corrupted data for a save file, and this is the first option I'd go with for troubleshooting, since it doesn't wipe any of your saved data. Now, if that doesn't work, there's the recreate hard disk option, which, as it says, will basically reformat your hard disk image when data has become corrupted. I actually had to do this for Conker's Live and Reloaded, but I suspect it was an issue on my end because I didn't start with a clean hard disk image like we've done here for this setup process. Let's go back and now select the graphics option and set our default graphics setting. For this showcase, every game is using the Vulkan renderer, but it's important to note that OpenGL will in many cases resolve some of the more annoying graphical issues. The only problem with OpenGL is that it's nowhere near as performant as Vulkan, and so realistically, we're just going to stick with Vulkan for this showcase. As a default, we can leave the resolution scale at native, and surprisingly, there are games that can handle 2x, which I will let you know about throughout the showcase. If we scroll down just a little bit, we have the aspect ratio option, and naturally, since I'm using the Retroid Pocket Nova, I will select the 4:3 option, but if you're using a widescreen device Like let's say the Retroid Pocket 6, definitely go with the 16:9 option. All of the options below this should just be left at default and disabled. There are only a few games where we'll really need to mess around with these settings, but for the most part we can just ignore it and leave them all turned off. The same goes for the texture cache size and submit frame buffering, and again, I will let you know if a specific game needs a change. So now we're at the GPU driver section, and probably one of the more important areas here since we're using a Snapdragon based device, which means we have access to lots of drivers. In this case, to keep things nice and simple, I am using the latest Turnip Drivers from the Steven MXZ GitHub page. Let's head on over there and quickly grab the latest drivers, which as of making this video is version 26.3.0-R3. And I will say that I tested every game in this showcase with release 1, but I don't think there will be much issue using the latest release available. In case the results are slightly different, just download R1 instead, which again is what I use to test. With the Turnip Drivers download, let's head on back to HakuX and then install these new Turnip Drivers. You don't need to extract the drivers and they can be installed as is in their zip format. Just select the install driver from zip option here, and then HakuX will show this as the active driver in this section. I recommend experimenting here with other Turnip Drivers, but in general, I had the best success with these. You can easily revert back to the system drivers by just tapping on the Use System Driver option. Alternatively, you can easily select between the various drivers you've installed by using the Select Driver option. And at the end here, we have the environment variables, which we can just ignore for this video. Let's head on back and we can skip over the audio section and then quickly look at the debug section. In here, you can turn on or off the FPS counter and then a few other options that are generally best to avoid. I think there might be 1 or 2 games that have an adjustment to the Tier 1 recompilation threshold, which is all the way at the bottom, but I will let you know if it's needed for a game. Now, one other thing here to be mindful of are the clear shader cache and clear code cache options, which again is useful for troubleshooting. In this case, if you find a game that was running decently at first and now is running poorly or experiencing weird glitches, it's not a bad idea to choose both of these options and see if it can resolve any issues. Again, it's just a troubleshooting tip and generally you shouldn't need to worry about it. The last option here is the Xbox dashboard, which we can ignore and then leave everything at default. Let's head on back to the main screen, and one last thing to discuss here is the ability to make per game settings. This is similar to many other emulators, and if you tap and hold down on a game cover, the options to adjust will appear on screen, and here's where you can make specific game changes that I will let you know about as needed throughout the showcase. And finally, HakuX currently does not support save states, so you are relying on each game's normal save system. And with that, we're ready for some games. Now before we get into games that work well, I tested around 50 games for this video, and naturally they weren't all winners. These are the games that either wouldn't load for me, had major graphical problems, or simply performed too poorly to be enjoyable. I'm going to put the full list on screen rather than spend several minutes going through every single one. And remember, HakuX is still early in development. Future versions can improve things, regressions can happen, and it's worth checking X1 box out since it may produce different results. So just because something didn't work for me today doesn't mean it's permanently off the table. Now let's get into the good stuff. For the main showcase, I will be focusing primarily on Xbox exclusives because that's where I think Xbox emulation gets especially interesting. We're going to start things off with Amped 2, and yes, I did test the original Amped as well. You'll see that one later because performance isn't quite as good. Honestly though, that's okay because Amped 2 is the better game anyway. Instead of going completely over the top like SSX, Amped leaned much more into actual snowboarding culture with real mountains, licensed gear, sponsors, and a career built around improving your reputation. The sequel improved the controls, expanded the mountains and trick system, and even added Xbox Live multiplayer. Unfortunately, after Amped 3 in 2005, the series basically disappeared, and more than 20 years later, 2K doesn't seem interested in bringing it back, which is a shame because this is absolutely a franchise I'd love to see return. Thankfully, Amped 2 performs really well with HakuX and is an easy recommendation. Buffy the Vampire Slayer still surprises me because this could have easily been another forgettable licensed TV game. Instead, it's a genuinely good action-adventure game that's incredibly faithful to the Buffy universe, complete with stakes, axes, crossbows, and plenty of vampires to send packing. A lot of fans still consider this the best Buffy game ever made, and thankfully it's also one of the better performers here. No special changes are needed, and I'm actually running it at 2 times the native Xbox resolution. If you remember Conker's bad fur day on the Nintendo 64, you might wonder what makes Live and Reloaded worth playing. After Microsoft acquired Rare, the studio went back and basically rebuilt Conker for Xbox in 2005. The models, lighting, environments, and animation received a massive upgrade. And honestly, this game still looks incredible more than 20 years later. The campaign is mostly the same wonderfully inappropriate adventure, though ironically, this version actually has censoring compared to the Nintendo 64 original. Rare also added an entirely new class-based Xbox Live multiplayer mode, which is where the Live in Live and Reloaded comes from. It's now accessible through Xbox backwards compatibility, including on PC, but HakuX also handles the original release quite well, with only a few minor graphical glitches, and is still the only way to play this game on Android. Crimson Skies is one of those games that I can jump back into today and immediately wonder why Microsoft hasn't brought this series back. It's set in an alternate 1930s where the United States has fallen apart and the skies are filled with fighter planes, zeppelins, and air pirates. You play as Nathan Zacher, who is basically an old school adventure hero and spends most of his time flying around and blowing things up. And you know what? I'm here for it. This isn't a flight simulator, it's pure arcade fun with ridiculous maneuvers, huge dogfights, and giant zeppelins to take down. With HakuX, I did encounter a crash at the beginning of the first mission when skipping the cutscene, so just let the cutscene play through and you should be good to go. There are some frame rate dips, but honestly, it's frickin' Crimson Skies running on the Retroid Pocket Nova. I'll take it. When the Xbox launched in 2001, Dead or Alive 3 was one of those games that immediately showed what the hardware could do. From the moment Aerosmith's 9 Lives started playing during the Attract mode, I knew I was in for a treat. Developed by Team Ninja under Tomonobu Itagaki, Dead or Alive 3 became one of the Xbox's biggest visual showcases, and honestly, it still looks remarkably good today. HakuX handles it well enough that I'm running it at 2 times the native Xbox resolution. There are some occasional dips, but nothing that bothers me too much, and native resolution is always there if you want more consistent performance. Okay, so now we're getting into, as my good friend Mike from Team Retroid would say, the deep cuts. If you've never heard of Death Row, I wouldn't blame you. Imagine a futuristic sports game mixed with a fighting game. 2 teams are battling over a flying disc called the Blitz, trying to score goals while also beating the absolute crap out of each other. You can even win by knocking out the entire opposing team. It's fast, chaotic, surprisingly strategic, and exactly the kind of game that makes Xbox Emulation exciting. We're not just replaying the games that everyone remembers, we're rediscovering awesome stuff like Death Row that most people have completely forgotten about. And thankfully it already runs really well and seems very stable with HakuX, running at 2 times the native resolution. Okay, I know Dino Crisis 3 doesn't exactly have the greatest reputation. Capcom took Dino Crisis, launched it 100 years into the future, put it aboard a spaceship, and then gave you a jetpack. You almost have to respect how completely nuts the premise is. The infamous camera is basically an enemy all by itself, and there's a reason fans weren't exactly thrilled with this sequel. At least we don't have tank controls anymore, and that's about where the improvements end. On the bright side, it performs surprisingly well with HakuX at 2 times the native Xbox resolution, and gameplay is quite smooth. Remember when every console needed its own party game? Well, Xbox had Fusion Frenzy. And think Mario Party without the board game. You're basically jumping straight into a collection of fast-paced 4-player minigames, and honestly some of these are still pretty fun. It also recently became playable on PC through Microsoft's original Xbox backwards compatibility support. And if you're playing through HakuX, this one runs great at 2 times the native Xbox resolution. So Galleon is definitely an acquired taste. This 2004 exclusive game from Toby Gard, who was one of the original creators of Tomb Raider, and you can definitely see some of that DNA in the exploration, climbing, and platforming. The controls, unfortunately, are not great, and I can definitely see someone trying this for 5 minutes and just noping out of the experience. If you can get past that, there's actually a lot of charm here. It's also a really good performer at 2 times the native resolution. There are some texture glitches, but nothing that I've encountered is game-breaking. It's weird, clunky, and charming, and that's kind of why I like it. So I'm super excited about Grabbed by the Ghoulies because it's interesting beyond just the game itself. This was Rare's first release after Microsoft acquired the studio, so after years of Donkey Kong Country, Banjo-Kazooie, and Perfect Dark, this was our first real glimpse at Rare's new Xbox era. And in typical Rare fashion, it's wonderfully weird. It's basically a spooky beat-em-up where Cooper fights through a mansion filled with skeletons, zombies, mummies, possessed furniture, and all sorts of ridiculous creatures. It wasn't the massive hit people expected from Rare's Xbox debut, but looking back at it now, there's a lot to like. It's also a good performer with HakuX, with only some smaller frame rate dips here and there. I don't think Halo or even Halo 2 need much of an introduction. I actually featured the original Halo in my Retroid Pocket Nova review using X1 box, and while it was definitely playable there, coming back with HakuX has been a really nice surprise. Performance is noticeably better and everything just feels smoother overall. And honestly, this is one of those moments where I think back to 2001 and wonder what 14-year-old Rob would have said if you told him that someday Halo would be running on something this small. Then we've got Halo 2, which went bigger with dual wielding, new vehicles and weapons, the Arbiter, who I personally think is an awesome character, and of course Xbox Live multiplayer. Halo 2 isn't quite as consistent as the original, but it still hits full speed frequently enough that I think it's absolutely worth keeping in this main showcase. Now, going from two games everyone associates with Xbox, let's switch gears with Jet Set Radio Future. Sega and Smilebit basically reimagined the Dreamcast concept with bigger environments, faster gameplay, and more emphasis on exploring this ridiculously stylish version of Tokyo. You're skating around, riding rails, tagging graffiti, and avoiding an increasingly ridiculous police response. And more than 20 years later, this game still has a look and sound that's completely its own. Seriously, the soundtrack alone is worth experiencing. What's crazy is that Jet Set Radio Future has never received a PC port, remaster, or digital re-release despite the original Jet Set Radio appearing on multiple platforms. So being able to take Jet Set Radio Future on the go is pretty awesome. Now, if you're watching this footage and wondering what the heck is going on, then Kung Fu Chaos is doing its job. It's basically a 4-player fighting game inspired by ridiculously over-the-top martial arts movies, and it's intentionally cheesy, chaotic, and ridiculous. But here's the cool part. It was developed by Just Add Monsters, the studio that eventually became Ninja Theory, the team behind Heavenly Sword, Enslaved, and Hellblade. So this is essentially a glimpse at where that studio got its start. It's also a great performer, running here at 2 times the native Xbox resolution. Alright, so I've got some history with MechAssault. When Xbox Live first launched, I played the absolute crap out of this game, and for one glorious 24-hour period, I was actually number 1 on the leaderboards. Now, was it only 24 hours? Yeah. Am I still proud of it more than 20 years later? Absolutely. MechAssault was also a huge part of those early Xbox Live days because it wasn't trying to be some complicated mech simulator. You jumped into a giant walking tank and immediately started blowing stuff up. Thankfully, the original MechAssault runs extremely well with HakuX without any special changes. Now, MechAssault 2 Lone Wolf isn't quite as smooth, but it's still solid. For this one, I enabled everything under graphics and set the texture cache to 2048. The game does seem to be slightly smoother with these settings, but I'm not entirely sure, and honestly, they don't seem to hurt anything, so why not? And what you're seeing in the footage is with those settings enabled. Between the two, the original is definitely the better performer right now, and being able to revisit one of my favorite Xbox Live games like this is pretty awesome. Ninja Gaiden Black is interesting because you can obviously play Ninja Gaiden on modern platforms, but this specific version is special. Black was essentially the definitive version of Team Ninja's 2004 game, adding enemies, missions, weapons, and difficulty options while refining an already fantastic combat system. We eventually got Ninja Gaiden Sigma, but Black itself has never received a native port to another platform, and plenty of us still consider this to be the best version. It's fast, incredibly satisfying, and completely unapologetic about kicking your ass. Although if it kicks your ass a little too hard, you can unlock Ninja Dog mode by dying enough times early in the game. And if you're like me, you may just purposely do it. It's okay, this is a safe space, and we don't judge here. The good news is performance is really good, and surprisingly, 2 times the native resolution performs pretty similarly to native. So of course, I went with 2x because this game looks absolutely beautiful. If you were a Sega Saturn fan like me, Panzer Dragoon Orta was a pretty big deal. Smilebit took the series' classic on-rails shooting and turned just about everything up a notch, and honestly this game still looks ridiculously good. The art direction is fantastic, the environments are incredibly imaginative, and it's sometimes hard to believe you're looking at something more than 2 decades old. Orta never received a PlayStation 2, GameCube, or PC release, although it did eventually become backwards compatible on newer Xbox systems. With HakuX, it's such a good performer that I'm running it at 2 times the native resolution with only minor frame rate drops, and it's definitely worth the trade-off. Phantom Dust is genuinely difficult to describe. It's basically a third-person action game mixed with a deck builder. Now, instead of cards, you're building an arsenal of skills that let you attack, defend, heal, and pull up all sorts of abilities inside destructible arenas. It's a really weird combination, but once it clicks, you'll understand why it became such a cult classic. Now, I'm technically cheating because Microsoft eventually released an HD version for Xbox One and PC, but the original is interesting enough that I just wanted to show it off anyways. We're not quite at full speed with HakuX, but it's fairly playable, and importantly, I haven't experienced any crashes. I almost moved this into the honorable mentions, but I think it's unique enough to stay where it is. Okay, so both Rally Sport Challenge games are already pretty playable, but each comes with a graphical quirk. The original performs better and can handle 2x resolution, but the car flickers and sometimes disappears completely, which, as you can imagine, makes driving just a little more difficult. Rally Sport Challenge 2 also has an issue with the car rendering incorrectly under Vulkan, but I find it much less distracting. OpenGL will fix it, but the performance loss isn't worth the trade-off. You can actually avoid the problem in both games by using the first-person camera. But if you're like me and need that third-person perspective, I'd probably stick with Rally Sport Challenge 2. The performance is still solid, and more importantly, I think it's one of the best rally games ever made. I will live with the graphical quirks. Spike Out Battle Street is another Sega deep cut you may have completely missed. The series started in Japanese arcades, and the easiest way I can describe this is basically 3D Streets of Rage. You run around beating the crap out of groups of enemies, grab weapons, and then take on ridiculous bosses. And sometimes that's all you need. The cutscenes are pretty messed up with HakuX right now, but actual gameplay runs solidly enough that I'm using 2 times the native resolution. Now here's one I never expected to become an Xbox exclusive, let alone see again from Sega: Toe Jam and Earl 3, which disappeared for years after the Genesis era before suddenly resurfacing in 2002 exclusively on Xbox. And somehow moving into full 3D only made the series even weirder. You're exploring Earth as Toe Jam, Earl, or newcomer Letitia, hunting down the sacred albums of funk and using the power of funk on some very strange Earthlings. It's colorful, goofy, unapologetically early 2000s, and that's a huge part of its charm. Thankfully, it also performs quite well and mostly stays at full speed. So at first glance, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 probably seems like a very strange choice for an Xbox exclusive list. After all, that game came out on practically everything. But we're actually playing Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2X, a version made specifically for the original Xbox. It combines content from the first 2 Tony Hawk games, upgrades the visuals, and even includes exclusive levels. And this one actually has a very special memory attached to it for me. Now back in 2001, just days before the Xbox launched, Microsoft held an event in New York City where I got my first opportunity to play the console. This was the first Xbox game I ever experienced, and it was also my first encounter with that gigantic original Duke controller. It's amazing what kind of memories games can trigger more than 20 years later, and this one definitely does that for me. This game does require the skip occlusion queries option toggled on under graphics settings. You will still have some flickering in the menus, but otherwise this is a very solid performer at 2 times the native resolution. Torque Prehistoric Punk is one of those Xbox exclusives that almost nobody talks about anymore. It's a colorful 3D action platformer where you play as a prehistoric kid who can transform into different creatures while traveling through time to rescue his father. It's not groundbreaking, but there's definitely some charm here. Performance is also really good at 2 times the native resolution. The only weird issue is the ambient audio. I tried different HakuX audio settings and I couldn't fix it. So my incredibly sophisticated solution was to simply turn down the ambient sound in the game's settings. Problem solved. Other than that, the game is an interesting exclusive in the Xbox library that otherwise would not get any attention. Tron 2.0 Killer App is interesting because while Tron 2.0 originally appeared on PC, Killer App was specifically adapted for Xbox, and honestly this is the version I prefer on the handheld because everything was already designed around a controller. If you're a Tron fan like I am, there's plenty to like here. You're exploring the digital world from a first-person perspective, fighting viruses with weapons like the Identity Disc, and the whole game nails that classic Tron aesthetic. I can get it almost running at full speed at 2 times the resolution, but for this footage I did stay at native where performance is more consistent, and honestly it still looks great. Unreal Championship 2 is one of those games I really wish more people talked about because Epic did something genuinely different here. You've still got the ridiculous weapons, jumping, and frantic Unreal combat, but now there's also a major emphasis on third-person melee fighting, and surprisingly it works really well. There is some annoying graphical flickering with HakuX, but setting submit frame buffering to single gets rid of most of it during gameplay. Unfortunately, that introduces a faint red square that follows your character around. But honestly, I'll take the square over the flickering. Now, performance can still be inconsistent, and this probably could have gone into the honorable mentions, but I was having way too much fun with the story mode to leave it out. And speaking of honorable mentions, I have a few games that are really close, but have one or more issues keeping them out of the main showcase. This also seems to be more about HakuX just needing time to mature than simply needing more powerful hardware, because I saw very similar results testing some of these on Snapdragon 8 Elite Gen 5 hardware. I also tried different settings and drivers, so for now these games just aren't quite there yet. The original AMP doesn't perform as well as Amped 2. There's some annoying graphical flickering and the frame pacing feels off, so thankfully the sequel is the better performer anyway. Blinks the Time Super gets close to full speed, but slows down too often for my liking, and if you're wondering about Blinks 2, that one performs even worse right now. Forza Motorsport is so frustratingly close. Now, setting the texture cache to the maximum 2048 helps with texture pop-in but doesn't completely eliminate it, and performance is right on the edge of full speed. I think this one just needs a little more time. I almost included Gun Valkyrie in the main showcase because normal gameplay runs pretty well. Unfortunately, using the boost dash can completely garble the graphics, and considering how important boosting is, that does get pretty annoying quickly. Now, Outrun 2 is a weird one because despite the FPS counter never quite reaching 60, it actually feels surprisingly fluid to play. For whatever reason, area transitions happen almost instantly, which looks strange, but honestly I'd still call this one fairly playable. I say give it a shot and decide for yourself. Now, what's really exciting is that both Otogi 1 and 2 go in-game and actually seem stable, which is encouraging, but inconsistent frame rates make them a little too slow for me to really enjoy right now, and a hard recommend as a fully playable experience. Unfortunately, it's basically the same story with Project Gotham Racing 1 and 2. Now, both work, but neither perform consistently enough for me to recommend playing through just yet. And so, that does it for this one. We've covered around 50 games, and there are still plenty I didn't get to, especially multi-platform games that were arguably best on Xbox, like Splinter Cell. So I definitely don't think this will be the last time we talk about original Xbox emulation on Android. Now, HakuX is obviously still early in development, but I'm really excited about where this is going and what it means for preserving the original Xbox library on Android. But until the next video, as always, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.